Hey, good morning, everybody. Hare Krishna, and welcome to day 2 of the Progressive Vaishnava Conference. We're happy that everybody's here. We're happy that everybody is joining us on Facebook Live as well. A little housekeeping before we start our presentation this morning. Our guest speaker is going to talk for about 45 minutes. At the end of the 45 minutes, if you have questions, or even during the presentation, if you have questions, if you'll put them in the chat box, and we will address all the questions in the chat box at the end of the presentation. I will look at the chat box on Zoom initially and see what questions we have there. And then I will check Facebook Live. So if you have some questions for our presenter, please also post to Facebook Live. So without further ado, let me introduce our guest speaker for this morning. This is Brother Alberto Verona. He is a psychologist and Christian minister. He is currently the director of campus ministries at St. Xavier University. From the years of 1998 to 2013, he was practicing in Gaudiya Vaishnava. His interest includes mystical practice and theory in Christianity and Hinduism. He lives in the Chicago suburbs with his husband, Jason Elliott, and their son, Nico. And I will turn it over to you. Welcome this morning.
Thank you so much. And I was so honored when I was asked to speak. I was involved with the devotees for so long, and no one ever wanted to hear anything I said. So it was really nice all of a sudden, so many years later, to be asked by Swami Padmanabha to kind of speak to the group. It was very, very nice. I should say I have been invited to speak by other groups, but anyways, so I'm very grateful to be here. How about we begin first with a little bit of prayer?
Sounds wonderful.
Let us pray. Gracious, beloved God, we open our hearts to you. We open our minds to you. Open ourselves up to your presence. We thank you for this time together with these devotees who seek you as their beloved, always in their life with such vigor, such enthusiasm. We thank you for this gathering of thoughtful-minded people who are trying to think forward, think ahead, think broadly about what it means to be in your life and to have you in their lives. What possibilities there are in eternity with you, Lord. Such creative possibilities, such blessed and ecstatic possibilities. We ask you, Lord, please, for special blessings for us, that we should listen to each other with open hearts and open minds, that we should know you better, and that you should continue to grace us with your loving presence and with intimate relationship in eternity. We pray all this in your holy name. Amen. I think someone's trying to join and I'm being asked to admit them. Should I admit them?
I just admitted him, so
Okay.
Don't worry about admitting anybody.
Okay.
I'll do all of that. Yeah. I don't think there's a way to, via Zoom, delegate those duties. So
Okay.
yeah, I'll take care of that. And I'll worry about the chat box too. That way you just worry about presenting.
All right. Do the slides show up properly?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let me see if I can move this. Well, friends, I wanted to start by saying that first of all, I was asked to speak about gender in some way, and it's not usually one of my favorite topics to talk about, but I was so honored to be asked to speak at all that I thought, well, I could talk about that. And then I realized, oh, I could talk about that. I have lots of thoughts and I have lots of experience with that. And so I want to just kind of say that what I want to talk about today is about the problem of men, and I mean to say it like that, so forgive me. And I am a male, and I am male identified, so I will kind of just acknowledge that. But I will say that I want to talk about the problem of males, or as one of my favorite evolutionary psychologists said, he said, the number one problem in humanity that needs to be solved for is maleness. And I kind of want to honor that. And I'm not trying to put males down completely. Obviously, I'm a person who values myself and other males, but I do want to talk a little bit about the challenges that kind of seem to be inherent in maleness, and then hopefully talk in a hopeful way about what that might mean for us. And of course, I think that this is a global problem. So I'm not picking today on Gaudiya Vaishnavism at all. I'm not picking on religion even. I'm going to talk about the ways that this shows up in religion and in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, but I do think that it's a more general phenomenon than that. So, and specifically, I want to talk a little bit today. I want to start by telling you that this is actually turns out to be of interest for a long time of mine. If you look here, this is an article I wrote for, I forgot which Hare Krishna news site in 2002 about women to the back in Los Angeles. It was based on my experience when my best friend and I joined the Hare Krishnas in, I think it was earlier than that. I had joined, anyways, it was some years around that time when I had first gone to the new Dwarka temple, ISKCON temple there, and saw that women were being asked to go to the back. And how bothered I was by that. And I was very, very interested in religion. Christianity had kind of sidestepped me, or sidebarred me, because I was a gay person. And so I was still curious about God, and Hare Krishna seemed just so interesting, so colorful, so aesthetically enriched, and so I thought, how interesting. But then I encountered something like this, and I thought, well, what's going on here? I'm very, very bothered by this. And my best friend was a woman, and so we were, beginning our experience in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. At this point, we had been in for a couple of years, I think. I was already initiated at that point. And she had to go to the back while I was in the front during a service, and we were there together, and it was very uncomfortable. Anyways, so I've been very interested in this problem. And now, again, I don't think this is a Gaudiya Vaishnava problem. I think it just shows up in that context in its own particular way and has its own particular paradox in it. And that's what I want to get to today, is the special kind of gendered paradox that happens in Gaudiya Vaishnavism because of its own mystical goals, and how that ends up kind of really feeling particularly uncomfortable in a certain way. So I think I'm going to talk a little bit first about psychology. So I was trained as a psychologist from the years of 2005 to the years of 2009. And I've been teaching psychology for 15 years and recently just left teaching psychology. And over those years, I was trained in many different schools of psychology, but particularly at first in psychoanalysis, and then later on through attachment theory, if anyone knows what that is, into evolutionary psychology, where I finally landed on some truths that just finally resonated. Not truths that necessarily felt good or comfortable, but truths that really resonated with reality as I had seen it, or as I had experienced it. And so I want to talk a little bit to kind of shorthand all of that. I want to just jump right into talking about male psychology. Now, I am super aware that these are generalizations. They are, in my opinion, true generalizations, but they are generalizations because males are not, kind of a uniform, homogenous category. Males are of many different types. I myself am kind of slightly kind of gender variant in some ways, and I'm same-sex attracted, and there are lots of variations. So, but I want to talk a little bit about kind of the, in general, kind of male kind of programming and software that males kind of have inherited over the last several 100,000 years plus of our evolution as a species. We've been evolving as Homo sapiens for about 200 to 300,000 years, and before then, of course, there were other humans. And we come from other apes and such. And I'm hoping that in the Progressive Vaishnava group, I don't have to argue all these things, but I'm open to it if that's what you want to do. But so I want to talk a little bit about male psychology. And in particular, I want to highlight the male bias for position and rank. And this is the kind of the real kind of heart of what I'm trying to kind of get to. So I just want to jump right into that. Males, for the most part, on average, come with a kind of programming bias in their psychology for position and rank. And there are reasons for that. Through the long course of our evolution and even our pre-evolution in other species that we kind of emerge from, kind of distinguish ourselves from, there have been certain privileges that come with the seeking of position and rank. So what I'm talking about here is a desire, kind of an intuition, or how could I say, an impulse to kind of seek and relish position and rank. And that seems to come on average because the privileges that come with position and rank are various types. And the privileges that come with it tend to be in the backdrop. So just so you understand the psychology of this, the desire is to kind of long for position, long for some kind of rank and status. And when you have it, you kind of relish it. And not the females don't have this, females also have this. And of course, psychologies are blended. Everybody's psychology has some male typical and female typical on a matter of degrees. But the people who are male tend to have kind of a stronger leaning towards the relishing of position and rank. And the reason is for that in the backdrop of that, there are some privileges that have historically come with that, which reinforce biologically and psychologically the desire for position and rank. And those are sexual access. People in position and rank end up having sexual privileges. They are desired more. They are given, sexual benefits quite often. In celibate groups, we see less of that on the face value of it, but of course, we still see it, right, in the problems that come with what, in Gaudiya Vaishnavism is called falls, right? You also get social immunity. We're seeing that, for example, in our country right now in politics, where people who have certain positions of power are kind of given a lot of wiggle room for bad behavior, right? And we're even asking the question right now, and I'm talking from the United States. From the United States, we're even asking, like, can presidents, for example, be held accountable for criminal behavior in a way that anyone else would have been, right? How much can they get away with that the average person would not have gotten away with, or that a person of color would never have gotten away with for even a moment? Right. So social immunity also comes with kind of rank and bias. And we know that wherever there are positions of power, people are getting away with all kinds of stuff. And we let it go. Right. And the statement, male boys will be boys, is really just kind of the beginning kind of flavor of that, where we kind of just give permission to anyone who even is male whatsoever for all kinds of misbehaviors. Just on the virtue of kind of maleness, what to speak of maleness with position, where we kind of give so much leeway. So the social immunity is one of the privileges that comes with that too. And of course, at the heart of position and rank is the honor given, right? So the kind of just the graces of being honored and bowed to, and genuflected to, and the prime food, fed first. I mean, name it in your religion, name it in your. I was just at a church service the other day, a Christian church service in the UK, and all the priests were up there, feeding each other the Eucharist first, right before anyone else got it, and then they got the wine. No one else got the wine. Maybe it's too expensive. It's not that expensive, right? So in terms of kind of the honor privileges that come with having some kind of position, and it's usually quite unconscious, right? We just give it freely and they take it freely, and really no one bats their eyes at it. And then there's control and influence, of course, the ability to shape reality, shape your culture, shape your religious community with your own opinions and thoughts, and the ability to kind of design the world as you would want, because you hold some position of rank and power, right? And so in religion, we see this so often, where the people who've been shaping things for so long have been males. Um, we don't even know what our religions would look like oftentimes if there had been kind of an equal influence of males and females, right? I'm guessing very different in some ways, right? So anyway, so these are some of the privileges that come with it. And I want to say that these are privileges that are in the daily life of a person who holds position and rank and who desires position and rank. But they're also at the species level. This has been going on for a very long time, which is, of course, what makes this the bias in the psychology of males something that gets genetically passed forward, because the privileges come with reproductive privileges. And whenever they do that, they're going to kind of genetically reinforce themselves and grow in the species. That's the basic principle of natural selection, Darwin's theory of natural selection. Now, of course, that's all the kind of the psychological kind of biasing backdrop and kind of programming that would kind of come in kind of with and prepared for unfolding in life. But the world then comes in and either kind of undercuts it a little bit or reinforces it and develops it more. And of course, we find that in most cultures nowadays, the cultures will reinforce the things that are already kind of built into the bias of our psychology. That's because that's the psychology we have and that other people have. Cultures could undercut this, and this is going to be the hopeful piece for us. But mostly they don't. And so I want to start kind of shifting over more to the Gaudiya Vaishnava specific version of all this. And again, I'm not picking on Gaudiya Vaishnavism. I could talk about it from the point of view of many different traditions. In Gaudiya Vaishnavism and in Indian culture in general, which is kind of part of the mixed flavor of that culture, these kinds of things have been reinforced for millennia. The idea that males hold some kind of special position is something that is probably based in our psychology, but culturally became a very, very valued thing, and then religiously got shaped into theologies and philosophies that are so deeply embedded that it's almost impossible to get away from them. There are exceptions to that, but for the most part, we can say that in Indian culture, there is male dominance, and that's something that is often encouraged. And in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, where you have Krishna as the deity, is very interesting because Krishna himself is, in some ways, and again, I'm not picking on Krishna. I love Krishna very, very much, but I want to say, Krishna himself is kind of a mixed character in that sense. If we take a step back and look at Krishna, Krishna is, in some sense, right, a beloved, tender, loving, playful, flexible, somewhat, sexually ambiguous, kind of character. And he's also a bit of a womanizer from the point of view of Leela, and controlling and in charge, and we let it go. He's God, right? So you kind of like say, okay, well, a little wiggle room for God to be who God is, right? And the Leela makes him a little separate from kind of the direct control of everything, but is certainly kind of the whole Leela is orchestrated around him, and that's acceptable if Krishna is God, right? But Vishnu does the universe stuff. Don't worry about that. And this kind of, and because in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, it's such a personalist religion, right? We see God as personal, and God as Krishna is not a symbol, right? This is not just artistic depiction. It's not some, symbolic thing. It is a literal thing. God in his highest identity, according to Gaudiya Vaishnavas, is Krishna. And so there's no way to kind of sidestep some of the uncomfortable stuff about his maleness by saying that it's just a symbol and he's just kind of a representation of, right? Where some religions will do that, they'll get away from the problematic male qualities by saying, well, that's just a way of talking about God. For example, in Christianity, where Yahweh is the kind of the core, father figure of the religion, male, and very problematic in terms of like dominance, control, aggression, right? All these kinds of things. And you sidestep it by saying, but well, God's not really male anyways, right? God's not any gender. And then you kind of sidestep the male problem. That's kind of at the root of that. And then, of course, there's the religion part of the Gaudiya Vaishnavism, or the Krishna religion, which is that we're called to subject ourselves to him. And while that is beautiful in all the mystical ways that is beautiful, it also is another example of these in which we are asked to subjugate ourselves to a male figure. And that's just it, right? That's just the core of the religion. And that's what I say at the end of the day. We don't know what religion would have been like in any of our religions if females had had a more active voice from the very beginning of them. But at this point, we can't even distinguish it. God is male, and we subject ourselves to God, and fine. And then, then the details kind of help us unfold how, how that will look, or how we can kind of deal with that. In Gaudiya Vaishnavism, of course, with Krishna, you have this profoundly beautiful mystical idea that God makes God's self available to us through multiple types of relationship, and that Krishna is supreme in some sense because, well, he's most beautiful, he might be most powerful, he might be lots of things, but one of the reasons he is supreme is because he offers the most kinds of special intimate relationship with his devotees. I'm sure you've heard something like that before. My former teacher used to highlight this all the time, that God is supreme in part because God offers so many different forms of intimacy. And when it comes to mystical theology, that's not wrong. In terms of mystical theology across traditions, Gaudiya Vaishnavism is the most sophisticated I have ever seen in terms of highlighting the kinds of relationships one can have with God using multiple relationship prototypes, right? They're not just prototypes of Gaudiya Vaishnavas, they're literal relationships, but they are several different prototypes of the kinds of relationships you could have with Krishna. And that's so beautiful. And then you have the mystical details of how to cultivate each of those, right? Something like in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, where you have these amazing details about how to cultivate all these different intimate relationships with God. But in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, there are really only two primary relationships that are cultivated. And this is where we start seeing the ways in which male psychology is kind of embedded in the Gaudiya Vaishnava context. It shows up in other contexts in other ways still, but in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, this is the way it tends to show up, is that there's two primary relationships that one can cultivate. Whereas in general, there are like 5 different rasas that one can cultivate in relationship to Krishna. In Gaudiya Vaishnavism, really only 2 are prominent, with Vatsalya, the kind of parental intimacy being one that's present but not really prominent in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. It's really, Sakya rasa and Madhurya rasa, or the kind of loving relationship and friendship, fraternity. Or loving relationship that's conjugal or romantic. And so then one is prototypically male, Sakya, and one's prototypically female. Now, these are all positions of subjugation. So you may wonder, well, so there's subjugation. So all these males that you're saying that are in power and seek power and love privilege and rank, they're seeking a role of subjugation. True. Again, I'm not just generally trying to devastate all males and say that we should be relegated to the edges of all reality and religion. But what I want to highlight is the way that, in my opinion, not accidentally males will seek their spiritual aspirations within Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Now, I'm going to sidestep here the question of whether God has already planted that desire in us, whether that desire is inherent in us, or whether it's cultivated through intimacy and relationship with certain spiritual people who have already cultivated that, or whether it's our own desires that are allowed to kind of feed into what kind of relationship with Krishna we want, right? Those are all very important details. Swami Padmanabha, I'm sure, has lots to say about this question of inherited versus inherent, right? I'm going to sidestep it and say that I do not believe it is accidental that when males tend to seek, this male-dominant tradition tends to seek loving relationship with Krishna, they seek 2 subjugated positions that are the highest ranking in the Leela. Of course, Vatsalya is high ranking, but again, just to focus us a little bit, Madhurya Rasa and Sakya Rasa are kind of very high ranking. Sakya Rasa is high ranking really in the sense that the best friends of Krishna are high ranking because they are just a step, in terms of mystical theology, they are literally just a step below the ecstasy of a gopi or of a saki, right? So in terms of what they're seeking, when males, ask the question here, given two options, male would want to preserve their masculinity, right? And pursue Sakya Ras, right? And of course, we know what the answer to that is. No, Gaudiya males, given two options, tend to aspire for Madhurya. And I'm saying that there's a reason for that. And the reason I believe that that exists, and you're allowed to kind of push up against me, I don't mind that at all. I like counter argument very much. And I honor counter argument as kind of very potentially valid. But what I'm arguing here is that I believe that the reason Madhurya Ras or some form of Saki relationship, Gopi relationship is sought out is because in the Leela, it's the highest position one can hold. And when you hear somebody of great influence described as somebody who might have been in a different rasa, that was and mystically inferior from an objective standpoint, right? People have very strong reactions. For example, with A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, when people say that A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami was in Sakya Ras, there's a very strong argument for, people have a very strong reaction that he could not possibly have been that because that's not the highest. Listen to the message in that, right? He cannot possibly have been that because, it's not the highest. And he must have been the highest because look who he was in this world. So the logic in that is a logic of privilege and position. He must hold a superior position everywhere he goes, right? And of course, in Leela logic, that doesn't really make a lot of sense internally, because whatever is highest is whatever you have been granted by God. But from an objective, mystical theology point of view, Madhurya is the highest. Now, let me say something, and I'm sorry that this sounds a little off, but I tend to speak straight to the heart of matters. Madhurya Ras gives you sexual access to Krishna, or at least indirect sexual access to Krishna. If you don't have direct access to Krishna sexually, which is something that theologically is developed as you get to have the ecstasies related to someone who did have direct sexual access to Krishna. So you still get to have the feelings associated with access to Krishna, romantically. You get social immunity from moral restrictions in the Leela. In the Leela, there's all kinds of things that are still considered appropriate and inappropriate. And when you enter into this world of Leela, you are also given immunity. It's okay. Krishna says it's okay. You're doing this with Krishna. Krishna's God. Don't worry about it. You get social immunity from what's wrong with what you're doing, right? I remember that my best friend years ago, I'm not sure if she's on here or not, but years ago, she said, I've never been comfortable with the idea that Rukmini, the wife, is not kind of a higher status than, let's say, these gopis who are having all these affairs with Krishna. She couldn't tolerate the kind of the moral implications of the Leela, because Krishna did have kind of official spouses, and she thought that should somehow be in the Leela more dominant. It is in some Leelas, of course, just not in the Gaudiya Vaishnava kind of frame of reference, right? Okay, honor. The people who seek Madhurya Rasa are promised the highest ecstasy possible. You will be given the most. You're not being left out of anything that a human can attain. Right? Special honor of you will be the highest, right? And of course, in this world, people who have attained such Leela are held in highest honor usually. In fact, when you talk about people who've, you could ask yourself how many people who've even attained any other rasa with Krishna are even mentionable by name, other than people who have attained to Madhurya Rasa, to some kind of intimate relationship with Krishna in that sense. And then control and influence, of course, and theologically, there's two different ways. First of all, the leaders of Gaudiya Vaishnavism from the very beginning have been mostly people in Madhurya Rasa. That's always been true in Gaudiya Vaishnavism from the very, very beginning. Other characters who are not Madhurya Rasa are present, but they never hold a position of theological prominence, usually, outside of their own small group. And even nowadays, you see in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, those who promote Sakya Rasa are also always still small groups. Always still very small groups compared to those who promote, Madhurya Rasa as kind of the highest ideal. So in this world, also Madhurya Rasa people end up exerting the most influence, and I don't think that's an accident. But also in the Leela, people in Madhurya Rasa are promised that they will have the most influence over Krishna. They are promised that if you're in Madhurya Rasa, you actually can influence Krishna. And the closer you get to Madhurya Rasa, the more influence you have of Krishna. So the gopis can literally control Krishna with their love, right? And with their kind of sly ways of kind of getting him to behave the way that they want him to behave. And if you're a best friend of Krishna, you can kind of influence him by whispering stuff about their romantic affairs in their ears. And, my previous teacher used to talk about that quite a bit. So the influence of even God, that God is under your control, really, if you were in one of these rasas, because the love itself pulls the heartstrings of Krishna. So you could really be actually in control of God by virtue of his love for you, right? So it's a willingness that God gives of himself to be under the control of his devotees. And so imagine how compelling that might sound to some people, that they would be able to actually even control God. Oh boy, I'm worried that so many people are coming in now and missing all the kind of the buildup, and they're just hearing my more controversial stuff in the middle, which was so dependent on what was said early. So please, everyone, be graceful if you haven't heard the earlier stuff before you get mad at me for the things I'm saying now in the middle. Okay, so a paradox emerges in Gaudiya Vaishnavism that I want to kind of highlight a little bit. I say here, religiously inclined males now choose sorry, this is covering my screen. Religiously inclined males now choose the female woman option. Now think about that for a second. This has been prominent in Gaudiya Vaishnavism for a very long time. The religiously inclined males, often heteronormative, cisgendered males, are choosing a female position that's already like, whoa. You could definitely not accuse any of these males of kind of misogyny, right? They ultimately desire a female role in eternity. They desire a female position in eternity, which is a socially inferior position, isn't it? Even in the Leela. But it comes with spiritually superior privileges, as I highlighted in the previous slide. So yes, they're choosing a female position in eternity, but that has the flavor of social inferiority, but it's spiritually superior. And so what I'm arguing here is that males, and I'm speaking here about all males, all people, but all males especially, and all kind of cisgendered, heterotypical males especially, seeking, tending towards positions that will offer rank and privilege or position. Okay. Now, the problem with this, of course, as you know, and we've heard in Gaudiya Vaishnavism for hundreds of years now, has been that this exposes them to accusations of effeminacy, homosexuality, perversity, right? So males who are pursuing this female role have, within the Indian context where Gaudiya Vaishnavism mostly lived, were often exposed to kind of some ridicule for having pursued something like that. And then we see how that plays out even nowadays, where combined with a culture that, disdains any womanness or femininity, what to speak of, sexual strangeness, right? And I'm saying strangeness not from my point of view, from a cultural point of view, right? This is something that they're now opening themselves up to by being kind of a heterotypical, male pursuing a female role. So in eternity, these males are pursuing something like Madhurya, which I do think comes with a privileged position of being a Saki or a Manjari, but preferably in the service of a very high gopi, such as Radha, or one of the people in her group, because she's also the highest gopi, right? So what I'm trying to highlight here is the ways in which highness, right, is kind of a thread in all of this. So hopefully you might be low in the rank of gopis, but or Sakis or Manjaris or whatever, but ultimately you're connected to the highest, and so you'll be kind of derivatively getting all the goods of the highest, right? So there is something to that. But there's now this paradox. What are we like in eternity versus what are we like in the temporal world here now? And I say Gaudiya males will choose positions of power and rank In the world, opposite sex attracted masculine manhood. So in this world, these devotees will still want the power and rank that comes from being a masculine, opposite sex attracted male, even if you're celibate, right? You're still a straight celibate, right? And so you still want to be like the highest you could be here, and the positions of power are going to go to the male typical, the very male typical masculine heterosexual males, even though, right, they're celibate. It doesn't matter who they're attracted to, but still it's the the opposite sex attracted ones who are often going to be the ones in leadership position. And we often encounter this in the most extreme form. And I don't think this is accidental in Gaudiya Vaishnavism or in other religions either, where you experience it as extreme forms of toxic masculinity with roles that include inflexible displays of power, the subordinating of females, the shaming of effeminates, and the demonizing of same-sex attracted people. And I've seen this encountered in all religions, folks, but I've seen it encountered in Gaudiya Vaishnavism quite a bit as well. And I think that the reason we see some extreme forms of this quite often is because they're trying to deal with the paradox of the eternal and the temporal. In other words, she protesteth too much. So because he is desiring something that it puts him under the scrutiny of kind of effeminacy or, weirdness in some way in eternity. In this world, they display the most kind of male typical toxic versions of that control, power, and privilege and rank that they possibly can. You see this in lots of male leadership and religion in general, but certainly in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, I think you have this kind of flavor there. You often will then see, as a result of all of this, a chronic suppression of female leadership and female valuation. It's not just about leadership, although I really think it's important to put females in leadership. In fact, I only really prefer to be in roles where females are leading. And I mean, I shouldn't just say in females are leading, where women typical people are leading, females, and then more woman identified people, because my concerns around the ways in which power is used. So there's this chronic suppression of female leadership and the valuation of women's voices, women or female voices, right? Where those thoughts are not even taken into consideration, right? And I know there was some protest even about the construction of this Progressive Vaishnava conference about whether female voices were being sufficiently valued. By the way, I offered to back out and leave my spot for someone woman or female identified, but I was told, no, it's okay, we'll move forward. There's often a chronic disdain of effeminacy. This is something that, of course, people who are kind of somehow gender variant or maybe even gay men are often accused of any form of effeminacy. Anything that looks even remotely effeminate is often disdained. You see that, by the way, I think theologically in the disdain for Sahajiism. Males who, in the pursuit of their spiritual identity and eternity as a female, will also then begin to act out that role in life in order to cultivate that more fully. And we know that in Gaudiya Vaishnava mystical theology, there are ways in which you meditate on these truths and these names and these clothes, right? So there are ways in which internally that's happening anyway. So why wouldn't we just go ahead and do it externally? Absolutely not. And I know there's theology to kind of argue against Sahajiism, but nevertheless, I believe that at the root of this kind of strong reaction to Sahajiism is also the sense of like, hey, you could do that inside of you, you could meditate on the dress that you would wear as a gopi, or the color that you would wear, or the jewelry that you would wear, or your special female name, right? But do not ever do this externally, because that would be weird, right? That would be weird. So I think this is rooted also in the sense of like trying to keep two worlds apart. The eternal world, where that would be okay, and the temporal world here now, where that's not okay. You have to still be kind of a strong man figure, That's a chronic disdain for effeminacy, I believe. The chronic degradation of males attracted to males, that's happening everywhere, but it happens in Gaudiya Vaishnavism as well, because of the way that opens one up to being non-masculine, the way that translates for people as non-masculine. and the strong reinforcement of the material spiritual dualism. And I do want to talk about this a tiny little bit more, if you'll forgive me. And Swami Padmanabha knows that this is an issue for me, and it was an issue for me in Gaudiya Vaishnava theology in general, in Hinduism in general. This strong divide between the material and the spiritual that I think is so problematic for religion in general. So I think this theological dualism, material world versus spiritual world, serves many important ends. And to keep us focused on what we're talking about today, although I don't think this is the only way that it's problematic, in male-dominated Gaudiya spaces, it serves as a preserver of that same male domination and temporal leadership, while simultaneously buffering those males against the cross-contamination of real-world misogyny, homophobia, and transphobia into eternity. And what I mean to say by all this is that they get to be males in this world and get all the benefits of being males in this world, while keeping that nice and separate from being a female in the eternal world and pursuing all that and having those two worlds not cross-contaminate each other, so they can hold both positions nice and cleanly, as I believe, because both come with privileges and rank, but never having one destroy the other. In particular, not having their desire in eternity render them somehow less masculine, less masculine, less sexually typical, and have them lose some status, which we know people who hold femininity or same-sex attraction in Gaudiya community will rarely ever have any position of significance and control and influence, right? Which is needed to shape something, right? Shape a religion. And so I think that this dualism, strong material spiritual dualism, where even my previous teacher used to talk a lot about consciousness, the realms of consciousness versus the realms of matter. I get it. I've studied the stuff around consciousness and matter. Quantum theory, of course, is telling us very clearly that those divides are not as clear as we thought they were. Reality just probably isn't so neatly distinguished. Whatever we call spiritual is probably very, very close to material, if not material. Whatever is material is also profoundly spiritual. And, in my opinion, this is one of the things that, religions that try to kind of say, no, God is in world is God. Any religion that kind of tries to blend these things is getting closer to what I experience to be truth, right? And so in traditions, not just Gaudiya Vaishnava, but in any tradition which this kind of strong dualism is preserved, there's usually something going on there. And in this case, I think one of the ends that's serving is to preserve this kind of male dominance. Weird to think that dualism would somehow preserve male dominance, but I don't think that that's an accident. Right. So rather than saying, well, the reality is dualistic, and that's why we say, well, it serves us to think that reality is dualistic. And that's how our theologies tend to also develop. Right. I know that's a little cynical, forgive me. Okay. So preventing the cross-contamination of the material and spiritual realms allows position and rank to be held here by masculine opposite sex attracted males in this realm, without the risk of losing that position and rank due to their aspiration for a feminine role in eternity. And I think in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, this is one of the things that's going on. And I know that in Progressive Vaishnava circles, there's some talk about kind of being a little less dualistic. I think that's very promising. Thinking less, thinking more about the ways in which we are spiritual in this world. And there's great theological reason to think like that, right? To think about how people who are advanced practitioners in the tradition are literally in their bodies spiritualized, where their bodies are preserved in different ways even. This is what is believed in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. It's also believed in Catholicism, that the bodies of spiritual people are preserved in a different way. Right? Where you say in Catholicism, if you dig someone up and their body is preserved, you presume sainthood. Right. And that's what you're seeing there is kind of the mixing of spiritual and material, saying, isn't it interesting when these worlds come together more fully, what happens? Okay. And here is kind of my single statement of the Gaudiya paradox, even though I don't think this is a Gaudiya only problem for sure, but I want to say Gaudiya paradox. Masculine opposite sex attracted male sadhakas dominate and subjugate females, gender variant and same sex attracted males, while simultaneously longing to cultivate a spiritual identity as a lavish, hyperfeminine lover of God, Krishna. And this is, I think, what I was trying to get at, the ways that this all shows up in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, which feels to some of us particularly like hard to kind of grasp, right? And so I'm just trying to give kind of a frame of reference, not the only one, but a frame of reference that could help us maybe understand something about why it plays out this kind of way. And male bias for position and rank is just that. It's a bias. It's culturally reinforced, but it's a bias. And so what I'm saying here is that this is not for everybody. This is not the reality everywhere in a general way, right? This is a generalization based on good data about male psychology, very good data, by the way, on male psychology. But of course, we know that not all males are like that, right? I myself will rarely take a position of power control until I've discerned whether I'm seeking that position for power or for service, right? And so that's, one of those things that I'm always thinking about because of the bias that I know. And of course, gender variant males can often be different than what I'm talking about here. Same-sex attracted males are often a little different than this, right? And females also have a bias for position and rank and power. So that's also possible too. It's just less prominent. In other words, it's not a bias. Some females may desire that. It's true. Or some woman-identified people might want that, even though they might be, but nevertheless, the bias in males, meaning that there is a leaning towards desiring it and relishing it more. And we see that it's quite data-driven. What I'm saying is quite data-driven, that there is this bias and that males are more likely to acquire, attain, and relish positions of power and rank. But because this is something that's a bias and then is culturally either reinforced or countered, that offers us an opportunity. And that's how I kind of want to wrap things up a little bit by saying, like, this is not like something that's set in stone. This is a bias. It's kind of a psychological programming, sure, but cultures have some influence over what ends up kind of getting elaborated and what ends up getting kind of softened. And I'm going to argue here that there are some possibilities here. And I think that the possibilities are pretty straightforward recommendations that I don't think is going to surprise anyone here. Encourage masculine, opposite sex attracted males, who are usually the ones who are in charge, even in our groups, right? And even in our progressive groups, right? Encourage them to soften their theological dualism, okay? And I'm going to just pause there and say, soften their theological dualism. In other words, simply say, let's stop talking so much about the spiritual versus the material world, and let's cultivate some kind of blending stuff here, where we realize that everything, God is in everything, and everything here, has godness in it, right? And that in God, even in God's, let's say, eternal Leela, there are people with bodies. They might be spiritualized, but they're bodies. So in other words, stop encouraging this separation and start encouraging Gaudiya Vaishnavas to also not be so dualistic in their terms of thinking about everything is corrupt in this world and everything is Maya in this world, and the needs of the people here are just their karma. Stop encouraging that kind of gross dualism and say, no, care about people, care about bodies, care about hunger, right? Care about warfare. So what if it's people's karma? I don't buy that, by the way. This karma argument always seems very, very shaky to me. But even if it was people's karma, care about it anyways. Care about material world stuff. Spiritually cultivate concern. So encouraging less dualism, right? But also to allow feminine expression in gender and sexual interest. People who are female or woman identified or same-sex attracted, all these kinds of variations on the masculine, heteronormative, cisgendered, character, any variation on that, encourage those to hold positions of power, to have their opinions heard. Well, in this slide, I'm really trying to say encourage those expressions to, let me see what I'm saying here, to allow feminine expression, gender, position it holds in eternity rather than suppressing and degrading these here. Anyways, I think I've said all that already. Encourage masculine opposite sex attracted males. Here we go. oh, sorry, to empower females, trans women, and same-sex attracted males. I'm not talking about just like gay males. I'm talking about anyone who's actually, I should say it more generally, any person who's attracted to both males and females, or any kind of different kind of gendered expression person. Just encourage difference to hold voice and be valued. This in and of itself will undercut this kind of problematic, toxic expression of this kind of stuff. And encourage these males that are often in power, who are often cisgendered, heterotypical, even if celibate, heterotypical masculine males, to also take more supportive roles and service roles overtly. Right? So when Swami so-and-so says, hold on, let me serve you, let him, right? Let him serve you when it comes to these kinds of things. When he says, how about you? You speak. You speak. Don't let Swami take the whole 3 hours, right, to talk. Let other people talk, right? Encourage a conversation and a dialogue between other people, not just those who are these kind of male typical kind of characters. I'll tell you over and over again, I've seen this in Gaudiya Vaishnavism since I first encountered it in 1998 or something like that, these males would talk, and they would talk for hours. No one else would be heard. No one. I still see it, by the way, online, even in progressive circles. Males just talking at people. No, encourage more dialogue, conversation. This panel is a great example. I love that. All right. Encourage masculine opposite sex attracted males to engage in conversations about the great costs of male leadership in the world and in Gaudiya history itself, right? Like, just get people to think about this stuff a little bit. And that's what I'm doing. I know that some people are probably annoyed at some of the stuff I'm saying, but I'm doing that intentionally. I want to encourage people to talk about the ways that male leadership has been problematic. And it's been problematic for a long time in the whole world. And it didn't all get freed up in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. It just became its own version of it. And so I just really want to talk about the great costs that come with it. I'm not saying males are bad leaders. They obviously have been running the world for a very long time. We have been. I always separate myself out, which is very interesting. But anyways, I just want to say that, I think it's worth kind of continuing to think about, not that there's no benefits to male leadership. There are, obviously, but the great costs of it as well. Right? For example, imagine, would we really have had as much warfare if we had had more females leading, making decisions about whether diplomacy, in other words, diplomacy/relationship, versus, let's say, warfare and aggression were the next best step, right? War is usually about territory grab, and, the more female typical psychology is to be biased toward relationship. That's a bias. It's not always present, but it's a bias. And that we might see a very different world if we saw more females in leadership, but we might have to make that happen intentionally because of the way that the bias lives. Okay, that's it for me. I'm going to stop, and I want to hear from other people. Again, you're encouraged to push back. I'm not saying my opinion is the only good one, but otherwise I'm very curious about whatever you're interested in, what I'm talking about, or something else.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. If anybody has any questions or comments, I'm going to encourage you to put it in the chat box, and I'll read the question or comment as soon as it comes in. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, please feel free to make a comment on Facebook Live. I'm following that on my phone, so I will ask any questions or relay any comments that anybody has. I was thinking, actually, at the beginning of your presentation, when you were talking about the male bias towards leadership and some of the things that were problematic with it. The first thing that came to my mind, and of course I have my own biases here because I have some strong opinions based on my own experience of being part of the religious organization for so long. But it would seem that if we are more intentional about female leadership within the various organizations, that some of the things that have essentially almost destroyed the religious organizations, in particular, I'll talk about ISKCON because that has mostly been my experience. When we look at things such as sexually inappropriate behavior, when we look at things such as criminally sexual behavior, you're almost exclusively talking about male behavior. Females do not tend to be sexually predatory. And I'm not going to say it never happens, because when it does, it makes CNN. And that's how we know it doesn't happen very often, right? Because the male volleyball teacher that molested a child doesn't make CNN, because it's almost everyday news, unfortunately. So that was kind of the first thing that I was thinking, in your first slide of how many problems that we have had that have almost bankrupt and destroyed the biggest organization, at least, would we relieve ourselves of if we had more female leadership.
I love that you're saying that, Vishnupriya, because it's absolutely true. The data is very clear, folks. The human problems are mostly male problems. Sexual assault, sexual abuse, molestation, pedophilia, murder. I mean, almost without exception, the data is very, very clear. And, that's the good thing about data, right? You could say, like, is this BS or is this true? These are all male-dominated problems, not just in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. It's a human thing. That's what I'm trying to say. And I love that you're highlighting that in ISKCON itself. And I'm also quite generous to ISKCON. I visit ISKCON temples all the time. They know me. They don't know who I am, but they know me. Anyways, you see it there. You see it in other non-Gaudiya traditions also that have kind of schismed off of ISKCON as well. That the things that are problematic are male typical problems, all the way from the more dramatic stuff that you've said, including murder in the 80s. We saw that in ISKCON, including sexual abuse, including kind of grotesque displays of power, including wealth seeking, right? Sexual falls, which definitely happen in females as well, but are more likely to happen in males. All these are more kind of male typical problems. And yeah, we would have seen at least less drama in terms of, people always like to accuse that females are more dramatic. It's like, I don't see where they get that information from. More, allow themselves to express more emotion, maybe, but the drama comes often from male behavior in these institutions, and yet nevertheless, the next generation comes in and they're still mostly males. No one said, hold on a second. An interesting phenomenon is happening in my own kind of in my own church now. I left Gaudiya Vaishnavism years ago, but in my own church, they're electing almost all women bishops now, comparison to us. And I think it's just because I really do believe people on some level, either consciously or below conscious awareness, are just saying, we're kind of done with male leadership. Would like to kind of try something different for a while. And I have a sense that's going to be a very good experiment. Not a perfect one. Females have problems too. There are some particularly female problems that I won't go into just because anyways, I don't know who's interested, but anyways, but for the most part, we're talking about male problems. And so thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that when we look at like the data today, when it comes to like, I'm talking about more in the secular world. I don't know that it's been studied in our small religious organizations, but when we look at it in the secular world today, where women are becoming in the secular world more equal to men. I mean, the youngest generation right now are going to be the first generation of women that are going to out earn men. The millennials were the first generation that women out educated men. And we're seeing that as women become financially equal to men, the rates of infidelity actually are pretty much on par with each other. Like, we had this long-term story about female sexuality, which I would make the argument of, until we stop putting all the rules and laws around female sexuality, we don't actually know what female sexuality is like. But what we can say is, like, now when people are becoming a little bit more equal, we are seeing actually that females do cheat. Their infidelity is almost at the same rate as what males do. But what you don't see is predatory sexuality, right? If a woman is going to have a fall or an infidelity within a marriage or relationship, it is usually with somebody who is at least appropriate. It's not predatory in nature, whereas we know that we can't always say that. Now, of course, I'm not trying not to make all men sound as though they're predatory. I know that is not the case.
But
we know we just don't see predatory sexual behavior in women. There's just no real instances of it.
or low, or significantly lower instances that are significant, right?
Yeah.
Significant. In
Yeah.
other words, you can see the numbers are different enough that say like that's important. That's an
Yeah.
important. And females don't tend towards pedophilia. There
Yeah.
are female pedophiles, but they don't tend towards pedophilia. There's a reason for that in terms of evolutionary psychology. We could explain that a little bit so far, not
Yeah.
super clear. And but females do cheat, and that's one thing that we do see. Females cheat, males cheat, and so there's a
Yeah.
whole kind of human topic there around like what's cheating about, because but females and males tend to cheat for different reasons,
Mhm.
and in different ways. But the cheating is one of those things we could probably much predict. You landed on one of the things that females do that's particularly problematic. There's a very high ratio of females who cheat, get pregnant, and then dupe males into raising someone else's baby, and it's like a very high ratio. So there are some things that females are, definitely not on the clean slate about, but certainly a lot of the sexual problems that we see and abuse problems that we see, power abuse and sexual abuse, and violence abuse are more strongly to male typical. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other
I think,
questions? Is anyone else asked any other questions yet?
hold on a second. We do have one other comment on Facebook. Let me
I'm
see.
very open, folks. Ask me whatever.
One person made a comment about great topic. Another person said absolutely on spot about every point. Let's see. Here we have one from our Zoom from Yamuna Devidasi. Sometimes we see that when a female gets a position that a male would normally hold, the female becomes more masculine. She seems to seek male approval by giving up some femininity in order to hold that position, either in a spiritual society or a mere material society.
Well, that's interesting. I can't say that I've noticed that myself. What I have noticed is that females who are less female typical anyways are more likely to also pursue positions of leadership and rank, right? So there is that. That's a kind of a bit of a reversal on what you're saying. It's like there are females, people who are born female who may be a little less female typical, a little more gender variant, who already are kind of expressing some greater interest in leadership and position. But to your point, it would make sense that once you feel drawn to the privileges that come with, and relishing the privileges that come with a position of leadership and power, that you're definitely going to do a lot of things to try to preserve that and keep it. And if that might show up in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, again, I haven't seen it, but if it might show up in Gaudiya Vaishnavism as a kind of a defeminizing of oneself in order to kind of preserve the status, that could be it. It also might be that when women start showing, or women or females or women, typical people start showing their voice and their opinions and sharing it and exerting power, that they're perceived as more masculine. There could be that too, that it's a perception issue, where then they stop looking so feminine to the rest of us because we presume that femininity must come with kind of passivity and quietness and things like that. So when women start showing themselves as full-bodied, full-minded people, that we perceive less femininity in them, and so it could be a kind of our own kind of projection too. But I hear you. I think that makes sense that females might do whatever they have to do in terms of their gender role to preserve a position once they've got it. That's what people accused Hillary Clinton of a lot too, by the way. They accused her every time she had a strong opinion or anything, that she was just, anyways, they would accuse her of not being womanly enough, right? And that was always a constant because she was so strong. I'm not necessarily trying to support all Hillary issues, but I'm trying to say, like, she was, I think, often mistreated because she would express opinions and present herself in strong ways that people had a hard time tolerating. I think Saradiya Rasa has something to say.
Yeah, she's trying to type it in because I don't think I actually have the ability to unmute anybody.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think that's the way it was just set up so that we didn't run into any, issues.
So no one would yell at me.
It's interesting though, because I thought Hillary Clinton the exact same way that you were thinking, because people seem to dislike her so much, and I just wondered how much of that had to do with just the fact that she was she was just an assertive person. I don't think that assertiveness would have been as offensive if she had been a male. In fact, I'd bet money on it if we were betting people.
She was just not the warmest person. And we want women to be, I'm saying we as a kind of collective cultural thing, right? Like we want women to be like gentle and soft. And what do you think? And she just wasn't like that as a person. As a person, she's just more like to the point and technical and strong. And people wanted her to be warm all the time. She's just not warm. Well, what the hell do you care if Hillary's warm or not? Like, do you need your president to be warm?
Yeah.
Have the males that we have put in presidency been warm?
Yeah. I was gonna say, I don't think anyone's describing Trump as warm.
No, he's not warm. They wouldn't like him if he was warm.
Right. All right.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, I thought I'll try and speak. It's a bit easier than typing. So my question was about related to people's aspirations, whether it's conscious or unconscious, because you mentioned that often you'll get individuals who actually are seeking power and position and control, and then if they find a religious institution that is going to potentially offer that to them, they're often attracted to that institution for that reason as well, whether they're aware of it or not. And I've seen many cases where someone is described as a great religionist in their group, and they're admired, etc. But if you look at the individual, you see that they're actually misusing that position of power. And I see this happening repeatedly. So how do we set up leadership structures so that we do not actually attract people who have that mentality of power and control? And almost these kind of, like, I'm not saying they're all narcissists, but they have these strong narcissistic tendencies. So what does leadership look like that's not attractive to those people?
Well, to the first question about conscious versus unconscious. So none of the things that come with our human design and our human psychology have to be super conscious. Consciousness in us, in other words, awareness in us is kind of narrow, and there's only some things that have to be conscious in order for them to be kind of expressed. A lot of this stuff does happen at the very automatic level. In other words, males are just automatically more drawn to kind of lead things, speak first, take on roles, right? All these kind of things. And females are less likely to be immediately drawn to that stuff. So it happens at the pre-conscious, like automatic level. But it also happens at the conscious level, where some people are very aware of that and they relish it, right? I have an male ex who only wanted the next job to be the stepping stone to the next job. It was like nothing about that job. It was about how that job would get them to the next job. In other words, it was all about position hopping. So it can be very conscious in people as well. And that's when you're probably seeing more what you call narcissism, which is a more dramatic kind of self-orientation that really, for the self-preservation and aggrandizement, is kind of pushes oneself forward more strongly. But anyways, what can be done is very important. The first thing is you should never allow leadership to be male dominated. I mean, that's like kind of like that's just like kind of an obvious one to me. It's like, if you look at your leadership and it's not, if the ratio of maleness to femaleness, or going even further, if the ratio of maleness to femaleness, kind of woman identified to man identified, same sex attracted to opposite sex attracted to both sex attracted, like if the ratio of your leadership does not adequately represent the population, then you're already seeing a problem. So you have to overtly recruit people to leadership who may not be automatically desiring it. And how interesting, all of a sudden, if you successfully recruit people to leadership who aren't desiring it, if you succeed at that, now you have people in positions of power who didn't want it. Might they still learn to relish it? Yes. but might they never relish it in the same way with the same desire to control and exploit? Yeah. So you might have to actually recruit people to make sure your leadership looks the way that your people look, right? Or in Christianity, we say that the clergy or the bishop should smell like their sheep, right? In other words, have the leaders look and smell like the people that they're leading. And so I think that's kind of an easy one. Now that's going to be very hard to accomplish. Like we're lucky nowadays, right? If for example, in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, if one female guru is allowed, what to speak of encouraging females to start initiating people, right? But that's what I think it needs to happen. People who don't want to be leaders should be encouraged to be leaders. And then the flip side of that, people who want to be leaders need to be stopped and go through a discernment process before they're granted that position. In other words, I don't know how GBC does their stuff, right? I've never known, none of us really know, but the way the GBC does their things in ISKCON, for example, but the minute someone is moves themselves forward or is moved forward by someone else, another male usually, to be in a position of leadership, we say, okay, so now that you want it or someone wants you in this role, you're going to spend 3 months reflecting and praying on what this role means to you and why you would want it. Right, to make sure making thoughtful leaders aware of their own desires for control, power, and privilege, rather than their their desire for service and ministry, which is what we're talking about. Like, how do you become a minister leader, a servant leader, right? I also think that we should make sure that our leader groups are never given too much power and rank, that they're fed with everybody else, that they're not given any kind of special, or be very careful with kind of feeding on the privileges that come with leadership also, so we don't pump up our leaders too much. I mean, we're like washing people's feet, we're like touching their feet as they come in, we're bowing to people as they walk in. Could you imagine the way that one's grandiosity kind of inflates when you walk into the room and everyone drops to the floor? And then you drop only secondly in a display. So anyway, so that's my answer, I think. I hope I'm getting to what you were wondering. By the way, I also noticed that in this, I don't know how many people are online, but almost all the people here are at least have female identified names. So where are all the guys who want to hear about, masculine? And maybe no one knew and that's an accident. I don't know. But where are all the men who want to hear a little bit about men in power? And that's just an observation. I could be wrong about that. Anything else at all?
Yamuna Devi Dasi said, "Oh my goodness, your whole idea of leadership is fantastic."
Thank you. You have to elect me to the GBC.
I had one more thought, and then we'll see if we have any more questions. I was actually, I thought it was really interesting, the point that you brought up about strong dualism, because I know, one topic that you hear about a lot, not just in our community, but just in religious communities in general, is this idea of spiritual bypassing. And I think one thing that for me is very encouraging about the Progressive Vaishnavas forum and this whole kind of movement that is starting to happen is that people are starting to understand and starting to really value this idea that, like, my spiritual community needs to also be psychologically a healthy community. And so you can't have, spiritual bypassing can't exist in a community that is psychologically healthy. And so I had never thought about like such the strong dualism that does exist in our communities. And we're going to have to probably reconcile that, right? So we get rid of I remember, and I'm sure most of the women that if you've been around for a while, they remember this too. Something would happen to you completely humiliating, right? And then you would be told, well, it's for your purity, Montague. Just psychologically such an unhealthy thing to say to somebody, we just damaged each other by doing these kinds of things.
I agree. And now imagine saying back, was there anything I can do for your purity, Prabhu?
Prabhu.
I very much love what you're saying. I'll share something personal in this regard. So when I decided finally, after many years, in Gaudiya Vaishnavism that I was going to kind of return to my, baptism as a Christian, there were lots of things going on there. A lot of them were just theological and personal. And so part of it was just like dualism didn't make metaphysical sense to me anymore, or the strong dualism didn't make metaphysical sense to me anymore, because I saw that it showed up in kind of this callousness about the world and callousness about human suffering. And I thought, for all Christianity's faults, of which there are many, there's at least the intention to care about people and to care about the world. And I believed at the time, and I definitely would receive a counter argument to it, but I believed that was rooted in part in the fact that Christianity is incarnational, where God actually entered into this world. But the thing here is that that's also something Gaudiya Vaishnavism has. In fact, if anything, Gaudiya Vaishnavism has a kind of incarnationalism on steroids, right? God is constantly coming into the world, right? In very physical ways, even though they try to say that it's not fully physical. And they try to do all kinds of acrobatics around God coming into the world. But in Gaudiya Vaishnavism and in Hinduism in general, God comes into the world all the time and is in the world. And then the Leela is being played out when it leaves this world in another world, right? Before you start talking about the eternal world where none of that's physical, but looks physical anyway. I think just a strong incarnationalism, which is not something that's exclusive to Christianity, but is cultivated richly in Christianity, but could be cultivated more in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, in the sense of like God comes into the world very much. So God obviously cares about the world, right? Or the idea of Nityananda as the most magnanimous, because he would go to the places where people were suffering the most, right? Things like these are theologies that should be cultivated, right? Cultivated so that we could remember that people suffer and that God's grace is needed all the way down. My former teacher had a depiction of Chaitanya with two hands upraised and Nityananda with one hand upraised and one hand downcast. And the idea theologically there was so beautiful. Was it expressed beautifully? I don't think so. But it was beautiful theologically, which is God is from the highest down to the lowest. The whole spectrum of reality is God's reality, and God's graces reaches all of it, especially to the lowest parts, with a special mission for the lowest, right? And so this kind of non-dualistic thinking, right? This is the idea that God is embedded in everything. We need our philosophies of God to be better too, right? Our philosophy of God is somehow detached in a separate world, doing his own thing, is not even aware of what's going on. It just doesn't really work. God has to be, at least in some very prominent way, very aware of the world and its suffering and very invested in changing it. And the whole avatar theology is rooted in that. That God doesn't come down here just to play. God comes down here to rescue, because God cares. This needs to be highlighted, right? Not to just yank people out of the badness, right? Oh no, you're suffering. Let's yank you out of suffering. No, you're suffering. Let me be with you. This is a theology that would be very beneficial. And I've talked to Swami Padmanabha about this, probably because he listens a little bit to me when I say these things, but I've been saying these things for about 23 years now in Gaudiya Vaishnava circles.
Yeah. Wonderful. It doesn't seem that we have any other questions or comments at this time. Okay. So we want to thank you for your time. I know we got you up nice and early this morning, as you're in Central Time, right?
Yeah, but we religious people pray very early in the morning, okay. So I was up, right? Okay. You all know that Gaudiya Vaishnavas wake up even earlier than Christians do.
Yeah. Sometimes I think I forget that sometimes, that I call people way too early. So, but we appreciate your time. This has really been a wonderful presentation. I've absolutely loved it, and I think everybody else that joined has loved it as well. We will post this on YouTube later today. And if you have any comments that come up, I'm sure that you can email them to the group or in the forum, and we will make sure that Alberto sees them.
Can we end in prayer?
Absolutely.
Let us pray. Beloved God, we thank you for this time we spent together. We thank you for making these spaces available for us to talk about you and how to serve you and how to lead your churches and your communities more fully in ways that honor you, in ways that lift you up, in ways that lift people up, and help us all in the cultivation of your belovedness. We ask you to continue showering us with your blessings, that we should develop in intimacy, that we should be granted special graces in our hearts and in our bodies to love you fully and be enraptured by your beloved love. And pray all this in your holy name. Amen. All right, thank you all
so much. Thank you all the devotees that joined us. I hope everybody has a wonderful day.
And thank you, especially Vishnupriya.
My pleasure.
For
I was on the right.
for your leadership, which was so good and so strong.
Well, it's a topic that I feel strongly about, so I'm very I'm happy that I was on this presentation.
I'm sure, and you have a great manner about you, and you have a great voice and very strong, good views. So I encourage you, take leadership.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
All right, Hari Bol.
Hare Krishna. Everybody have a wonderful morning.